Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In the third part of Plato's dialogue, the Gorgias, where Socrates is engaging in discussion with Callicles, whose house the conversation is taking place at, and where Gorgias and Polus are Calicles' guests, there's a back and forth discussion, and then Calicles actually criticizes Socrates for engaging in philosophy far longer than a grown man should. Philosophy is something that's good for your early education, but you should leave it behind and take on the sort of interests and desires and occupations of a real man. And Socrates is not doing that. And then Socrates brings in this very interesting discussion where he is admittedly being rather ironic, or at least, let's say, hopeful about this guy Calicles, who he's engaging in discussion with. And he tells Calicles that he considers him a godsend, that literally he got something from Hermes by happening to be there and happening to get involved in this discussion. It's the word is for sort of like a fortunate accident, in a verbal form that's being used there in the Greek. And so why is this such a great thing? He says, well, if my soul were made of gold, don't you think I would be delighted to find one of those stones wherewith they test gold, the best of these stones which I could apply to it? So there's this analogy to testing for gold in the soul. There's some sort of procedure, some sort of body of knowledge for figuring out whether something is genuinely gold, genuinely valuable, or whether it's just a facsimile, a fake, something that looks like gold but actually isn't. And one of the terms that gets used here quite a lot is the word for agreement. Here in the optative, homologesein, but it's also used verbally in other cases. And the idea here is of correspondence, or being on the same page, we could say. And so Socrates is saying, listen, if I can find things where you actually agree with me, then I know I'm on the right path, because you obviously are somebody who can, in fact, figure out who's right and wrong, who's got things correct, and who has things mixed up in their soul. And so he says, if we can have an agreement that my soul is well nurtured or well raised, well brought up, tetheropeusthai, right? And the word that's used before that is kalos, so nobly, in touch with the higher values, the better things, that I have had not just my body nurtured, but my soul has been nurtured. If you can agree to that, then no further testing would actually be required, because you're that stone. You're a good tester. And he goes on and he says that, we can test, and the word here, basanein, is a very interesting one, because it can also mean to put to the torture. It can mean all sorts of things. This is testing in a rigorous way that could actually be somewhat painful or deleterious to the thing being tested. So he says, I'm convinced if you agree with the opinions held by my soul, we'll have attained the actual truth, aletheis. For I observe that anyone who is able to adequately test a human soul, right? Whether that soul, now the translation here is live good or evil or well or wrongly. In the Greek, it's just whether souls live rightly, orthos, whether they live rightly or not. So it could be, living wrongly. And the idea is that somebody can, in fact, be the tester, the assayer of souls to determine whether they are living in the right way or not. Well, somebody like that would have to have certain qualifications. This isn't the only place, of course, where Socrates talks about that. In the Credo, it's also mentioned somebody having, knowledge of what's just and unjust, what's good and bad, what is beautiful and what is ugly. And knowledge is, in fact, going to be one of the three qualities, or you could say, if you want to, the three criteria of the human being who is fit to judge accurately the souls of other human beings. Not that other people don't judge each other constantly, but here we're talking about who can actually judge correctly, who can come to the right verdicts. And so Socrates says that by my observation, there's three things that are needed in order to judge these things rightly. One of them is knowledge, episteme. You got to actually know what the hell you're doing. You've got to understand human souls, human affairs. You actually have to know what is good and what is bad, right? So this kind of overlaps with what he was saying in the Credo and in other places as well. You don't just need to have like a gut sense or intuition or something like that. You need to actually know what the hell you're talking about. But then that's not enough. Knowledge is great, but there's some other qualities that are just as important. And one of these is what in ancient Greek is called eunoia, literally. So noia is coming from nous, mind, and eu is good or well. So being well disposed to another person, having goodwill towards them, wanting what is best for them, wanting them not to suffer or encounter or be destroyed by evil. And so that's really important as well. And then there's a third thing that Socrates tells us is really important. And this is something that the Greeks, at least some of the Greeks, did in fact value and talk about quite a bit. Frankness or freedom is another way of translating it, of speech. Parousia, being able to say what's on your mind, that's the freedom of speech aspect, but being disposed to actually tell people what you think, not to conceal, not to hide, not to be, to translate another term, not to be bashful or embarrassed, to come right out and say what you think, to be straightforward, right? We often say, so a person who wants to test whether other people's souls are in good condition or not, whether they've been raised properly, they have to have all three of these qualities. Why? Because it's an interpersonal engagement. And he says, Calicles, you've got these. And then there's a long and interesting discussion about why that's the case. So he says, I encounter a lot of people who can't test me because they're not wise like you. So that's one thing that eliminates people right off the bat. If you're just an ordinary person, you don't have any wisdom or knowledge, you're not going to be a good judge, even if you're using somebody else's techniques or what your culture has given you. And, he says, Callicles, I know that you actually have received a good education. A lot of Athenians would agree to that. Now, is Socrates being ironic here? Yes, he is, because he doesn't think that the education that a lot of Athenians have gotten is actually one that produces knowledge. Let's put that aside, though. Let's say that Callicles actually does have knowledge, that he is wise. Does he have goodwill to Socrates? He just said mean stuff to Socrates a minute ago. So you might say, well, he doesn't seem to have goodwill to Socrates, but Socrates says you actually do. There are others who are wise, but unwilling to tell the truth because they don't care for me as you do. Our two guests here, Gorgias and Polus, Well, they're wise men and friends of mine, right? They qualify for that. You do too. How do I know that you are actually well disposed to me? You make the same argument about don't study philosophy well into adulthood to other people. You're being consistent in what it is that you're telling them. I think that you care for them. You're giving me the same advice. Therefore, you must care for me. You're not doing it just to be mean. You're not doing it to put me down. You're not doing it to shut me up. You're doing it because you really like me. You care about me. And you want the best for me. Again, he might be a little ironic in that as well. Frankness of speech, Calicles definitely has that. And here's where Socrates says something interesting. So Gorgias and Polus, these guests, they are knowledgeable, they have goodwill to me, but they're more deficient than they should be in outspokenness and somewhat too bashful. How could it be otherwise when their bashfulness is so great that out of sheer timidity, each of them ventures to contradict himself in the presence of many people and about matters of supreme importance? But that's not you, Callicles. How do I know that? He says, it's clear that you are inclined to be frank and not bashful. Why? By your own statement and confirmed in the speech you made a short time ago. You are willing to call me out on what you think I'm doing wrong. You're not going to hold back. So clearly, you actually have the frankness of speech that's needed in order for knowledge to be put into effect and goodwill to be displayed. Callicles speaks his mind. Unlike the other two, now we're finally getting to the bedrock, you could say. And so Socrates says, again, he may not really mean this completely, but he's sort of sketching what it would be like for somebody, an imaginary interlocutor who really was the tester of souls, who could tell us whether we're living rightly or wrongly, have got our heads on straight or crookedly, whether we're well-formed or badly formed. They would need to have these things, and he is saying, I'm so lucky that I did find you, because now you can tell me whether I've got things right or not, whether you agree with me or not. So these are some really interesting observations here. Callicles, if you read the dialogue, doesn't really live up to these other than the frankness of speech. I don't think that you can say he is truly well-motivated in terms of goodwill. He clearly doesn't know what he's talking about when it comes to some important matters, although he does have some knowledge of other things, and so he's not the genuine tester. But this is sketching out what somebody who would be a great interlocutor to have, somebody who would benefit us, what it is that they would look like, what characteristics they would have to have and to display to their fellow interlocutors.